Welcome, Dr. James Beckett, Sports Card Insights. Thanks to Darin Ostrom, I have an episode I think you'll like today. Darin sent me his manuscript for his book that he's still polishing, but it's Sports Card Innovations in the 90s. I don't need another book, actually, but I had gotten a pre-release copy of Pops and Cobs from Jeremy Lee, and I really enjoyed that. And I got this from Darin, still a lot of pages, but not as many. Thought I'm going to give some feedback to Darin this way, because hopefully that'll encourage you to get the book when it comes out. But first, thanks sponsors: Topps, Panini, Upper Deck, Heritage Auctions, Huggins Scott Auctions, Mike Stadium Sports Cards, Burbank Sports Cards, ComC, and Beckett Media, Beckett Grading, Beckett Authentication. Rich and I talked a week or two ago about history books and who would do it. This is not a complete history that Darin is doing, but he's pretty exhaustively looking at the 90s, the late 80s, and the 90s, and there's so many companies. And I just read it and I thought, wow, Darin is giving a great retrospective of what was going on and pulling things together. But I was dealing with it in real time, and it was very chaotic when you think about it. Back in the late 80s, the early 90s, the mid 90s, the baseball strike, the late 90s, with all these inserts and all these different, what he calls innovations. And I think he's right. So it's a book you'll want to get. If you're not interested in the 90s at all, it's still an interesting read because it's history and it's accurate. The other thing Rich and I talked about was about when you do a book like this, does it need to be linear? Do you need to start with 1990 and then go to 1991? And Darin has not organized it that way. He and I will talk about that because I think it's tricky to bounce around a little bit when you talk about different companies and then you refer to different concepts with inserts or parallels or subsets, things that he has done. Rich said I needed to talk more about the 80s a few weeks ago. This is the 90s, but also get some late 80s in there too. If you're interested in this stuff, it's the history of the hobby. So I definitely want to be covering it. And Darin has done a lot of the heavy lifting. I don't know what other source materials he had. I'm sure a lot of this stuff was in our magazines. He's dealing with mainly baseball, but football, basketball, he covers them all a little bit. And he mentions through the 80s and the 90s, collectors were buying fewer cards but paying more. And they went out of business, a number of them, because of that. That it just didn't work. Even now, people ask me questions about, are we in another overproduction era? And it's because of all the parallels and all that stuff. That's a different kind of problem, but still perhaps related in that you're putting out a lot of cards that don't have much value, and then you're trying to create value for some of them. It's just tricky. Darin seems to give a lot of credit to Score and Sportflix coming in and I think maybe in some sense paving the way for Upper Deck. What it felt like to me, because I knew the Sportflix guys and then I knew the Score guys, very sharp and went about it the right way and saw them at different things. But Sportflix never really caught on. I don't think it ever really was a mainstream. You couldn't photograph it very well. You couldn't see it. If you showed it to another kid or somebody else, you'd have to hold it just right if it was a 3-player card or a 6-player card. Darin was more enamored of that than I was. And I give a lot of credit to Upper Deck, whereas Score provided maybe even a better product than Topps, Fleer, and Donruss in 1988, but it wasn't a game changer. They had color on the back, but Upper Deck doubled the price. That really jump-started the modern hobby of more expensive is better. Upper Deck, I saw them in 88. They were at the National, and they were passing out their promo cards. I don't want any company to fail in the industry. I like for everybody to do well. I'd like to make the pie bigger. Okay, Darin is talking about Topps in a way that is interesting to me because his perspective is different. I grew up with Topps and watched Topps evolve and to interpret some of their conservatism and their being an incumbent as being lazy. I don't think they were lazy. I think they had the way they did things. When you're running a business, the market leader doesn't always innovate if they don't need to. And if you think about Topps' creativity during those days, just look at the early 80s of what Topps was doing in basketball. They were scrambling. They had something that wasn't working, and they tried several things that didn't work, but they tried. And so I don't think in any way were they lazy, but I think they were conservative, and they were the market leader and the hobby was evolving. Relaunching Bowman, I'll do a whole episode about cash grabs. I think when you're running a business and you put a new product out there, if it's perceived as not a great product, it can look like a cash grab in one sense, but that I assure you companies are not trying to do that, especially the card companies. They were throwing things out there to see if it would work. frankly, if it would be a cash grab, if it would be a moneymaker, which some of those were not, then that would mean they could keep doing it and build on that brand. So again, I had a little different take. 92, he talks about Bowman really hitting their stride with even stronger rookie card and prospect identities. And I remember at the time, that was tricky. You had Street Clothes, Mariano Rivera, and all that. He's very excited about Stadium Club, as we were. Very excited about Finest, as we were, that it came out. I thought a little problematic that you couldn't always easily tell which ones were the refractors. They were so nicely done. Some of you think, is that if you wanted it to be a refractor? And it probably wasn't. Probably, Darin, a little bit hard on defunct companies. And not only do I get that, I think it's probably justified. They made some choices and some decisions that didn't really work. Darin points out, and I'd never really thought about this, thank you, Darin, that Action Packed was like a 3D card because they had a relief and they had Braille on the back of some of them. I'd been dismissive of that. The main thing I thought about with Action Packed is it's twice as much cardstock because you've got to print it and it's more complicated. And then you've got to sandwich it, wrap it around, and glue it. So they were at a disadvantage cost-wise and production-wise, but never really caught on. It was thicker. Some of the plastic sheets in those days were tight, so you couldn't do it. He and I had talked about Lud Denny and ProSet. And it's not that the NFL didn't care about football before Lud came along. Really, it was just a baseball card hobby. And so pouring money into marketing, they needed somebody like Lud Denny that would come in and make a splash. And thank you, Lud, because anybody that loves football cards, he was the rainmaker. One of the things I got into with Darin in my episode with him was about star picks and front row and signature rookies and superior picks, all these things, but also classic, all these that were not fully licensed. They weren't league licensed. They were draft pick type sets. I just got to say, I do not lump classic in with the others. Not that so much that they were cut above, but I knew Ken Golden. I knew his dad. His dad was a very sharp business guy. Ken obviously has gone on to great stuff, but classic had endured through that, where the others were a little bit in, and then now you see them, now you don't. Classic was the one that I had the most discussions with Ken, mainly about getting it in the monthly magazines. And there really wasn't enough price movement, and they weren't really rookie cards. Now people want to say there was rookie card controversies. It really wasn't that controversial in those days, partly because I think we had laid out some rules that made sense to people, and we had a large market share. Again, people could always buy up other stuff and say it's not a rookie card, but I think it'll eventually be a rookie card. That's what people have done with Star Basketball. They bought first and then lobbied for true rookie card status and had enough people listen, including PSA, that it done really well. But the ones that did the best got in early. Darin gives kudos to Pacific. I do too. Another book that I read was Mike Kramer's book, but all the die cutting that he did, the first Prism, and again, just with Darin laying it all out, I think, wow, I had great esteem for Mike Kramer, but even more now when I read how Darin is laying out all this, just one thing after another, where Mike had got ahead of the game. One place I differ, Darin, is on the interpretation of wildcard. I think wildcard was an idea that eventually would have imploded anyway. In fact, it may have been amazing that they went that long. When you think about it, the concept sounds interesting, but if you work out the execution of it, you need to have giant warehouses of 1,000 card lots to be able to redeem the 1,000 stripe card, to give them 1,000 commons. You had to have all this extra stuff that you really couldn't sell. You could only trade it. And I think there was some kind of a restocking fee or something. And I think a lot of that stuff went through maybe Tennessee. So you wonder, where's all this other stuff? Occasionally bought collections that had a lot of stripe cards in there, but where are all the base cards? Did they get dumpstered? I just don't know. It's romantic to think that Wildcard would swap out these 210s for a 20 and 520s for 100 and 1000s for 1,000. They'd have to have a warehouse full of all this stuff on the shelf, sorted to where they could swap it out. And you've got problems with potentially theft or organization. Those 1,000 stripe cards are just really tough. I have one because y'all know I try to have kind of one of everything. I don't need the corner of the market, but I just want to see it and hold it and touch it. Collector's Edge, I'm harder on Collector's Edge because I knew some of the people there. And at one point, I got one of their offering memorandum things for getting investment in the company. One of my buddies brought it to me and said somebody wanted him to invest in that. What did I think? It was speculative, but the Collector's Edge guys were extremely aggressive, and they acted like they were doing limited production runs, but they had so many versions, and their limited production runs were in the hundreds of thousands in some cases. And they had this sweet relationship with Shop at Home or Home Shopping Network, Playoff and Score. Those, for most of the time, were local. When Darin started talking about Topps buying Bowman, I'm actually going to do another episode about how I think that came about, where the pressure was and what was the tipping point there. But while I'm saying that, I do not know, and if somebody else knows, you could tell me, but why all of a sudden was Philadelphia Gum picking up the NFL? Why was Topps going to the AFL? Was that negotiated? That doesn't make sense to me. The NFL was the major play. Actually, the AFL in the 60s was a more exciting brand of football. I won't deny that. But the more known players, and by 64 through 67, yeah, some of those guys, and especially you get Joe Namath in there in 65. Another thing was about Ted Williams, and maybe that had something to do with Topps buying Bowman, and then Fleer, having done the 59 Fleer Ted Williams set, jumping back into the market. But I just think Ted Williams sat out. I think he had some sporting goods contracts or things like that. He was an avid sportsman, and it's a fighter pilot. So he had no cards in 52 and 53. And then 54, he had 2 cards. He had the bookend, the first and last card in 54 Topps. But then he had card 66 for a short time in 54 Bowman. And I need to look deeper into that. I don't know that I have a definitive explanation for that, but Ted Williams was a big deal in those days. Darin mentions print runs of 1 million. I believe there are more than 1 million Ken Griffey Jr. Upper Deck cards. And I think Topps was in that range in the 80s and 90s as well, of their flagship brands. A lot of cards out there. So that's almost 1 billion cards in a certain product. It's just crazy numbers. And that's why when people say, hey, why can't the companies be fully transparent and number all the cards? We would freak out, I think, if we saw it was numbered to 1 million. I would say that would be crazy. When people talk about overproduction, we'd be comparing to that. We just need to have supply less than demand. If supply is greater than demand, then you're going to have cards sitting around. Okay. It talks about the early card shows. Really loved going to those early card shows. The other thing about the cash grab was when the market got really competitive in the late 80s and the 90s, it's not a cash grab, I don't think, to try to maintain your shelf space at retail. It's use it or lose it. In fact, you're paying for the linear feet you have there. I wouldn't call it a cash grab. It's protecting your turf. You've got to fill the shelves or they'll put something else in there and you may not get back to it. Cash grab is very different if you're a customer than if you're putting out a product. If you're putting out a product, you're trying to make profit. You're not trying to make obscene profits, but you're trying to be profitable. And if it's a cash grab, that really just makes people mad and is damaging to your brand. And he talks about the Lombardi Trophy and the Stanley Cup, the holographic things that Ludd did, really great. There's a section in here about rookie cards and the rules. And the only thing I could say, looking back, is especially in the early days, we set up reasonable rules, and it wasn't just an edict. It was what people were doing that we just codified. So we didn't make something up. It was, this is the way people thought. And so we articulated it more clearly. Now, Darin's looking back at it, but at the time, I never thought this is going to be in cement. I just thought these are principles that are reasonable. And Victor Roman Sr. has addressed that some, but again, rookie cards are important in the hobby. And if there's a little bit of ambiguity about it, I don't have a big problem with that. I think that adds a dynamic element. If it's chaotic, that's another story. So I've said one of my goals in life, whatever I'm meeting with people, I want to bring order out of chaos. If something's messed up, I want to help make it not as messed up. If somebody's stuck, I want to help them get unstuck. The hobby needed cataloging. It needed price guides. I also felt it needed an alternative grading company that was different, and we hoped better in many respects than PSA, but the marketplace is the final determinant of success. And as I've said, I think PSA did an awful lot of things right. We competed vigorously with them, and they are dominant at this point. Rich said that I've shortchanged the 80s because it has a little bit of a junk wax connotation, and yet there's still as we've said, lessons to be learned. We don't want to go back to that. Darin mentioned about Fleer, which is out of business now, but when they had the Billy Ripken error card that had the obscenity on the bat knob, the error card, he thinks there's hundreds of thousands of those. I don't think there are. I think there's absolutely hundreds of thousands of cards in all the variations, maybe even up to 1 million. But the original error card, I think, is much less than that. They had so many attempts to correct it. I think if they made 1 million of that card, 900,000 of them are some variation of the correction with the notching or the splotchy stuff or the scratch out or whatever. Another thing Darin is mentioning, his perspective is that all the card companies would occasionally go back to press, printing additional cards as they ran out and as distributors were requesting more boxes. I don't think that's the way it was happening. I think in most cases, I think you will find there were extra sheets. When a card product was doing well, they could then cut the extra sheets. But if you've got a configuration of the pack that has to have certain inserts in there, if it's just straight cards like it was in the 50s, you're just going to do cut card cases, which I don't think they do that very much anymore. So I don't think it's going back to press. I think it's taking the sheets of cards, cutting them up, collating them, and distributing them that way. It's very expensive to go back to press. If you cut 90% of the stuff and distribute it, and then you sell out, then you could do more. But you better have some goodies. Rich and I were talking. Darin, you're doing a narrative history with chapters of what was happening and pulling things together. And when I read through it, I realized that I tend to be more encyclopedic, where it's easier to look something up. Okay, it would be hard for me to find something in your manuscript other than going to one of your 30 chapters and saying, oh yeah, it was in a chapter with inserts or parallels or whatever. But I'm realizing now that when I was doing the price guides, the order of the sets so that you could find it was a big deal. My podcast is narrative. It is not encyclopedia. It's not pedic. It's not linear. It's narrative. And so in the episodes in the 500s or the 800s, it wasn't dealing with something that was all over the place. So, Darin, that's one thought I have, is that in the way you structure this, it doesn't read like a novel, but it reads really interestingly of what was going on. But if I knew that it was a book about the 90s and I opened the middle of the book and it was on telling what was going on in 95, I think that would be easier for me. On the other hand, like I said, it reads very interesting because I was there. So not everybody was there. And so if you want to learn from the past, you have to listen to people that were there and who have documented as Darin has. So, yeah, thanks, Darin. Thanks, everybody. I'll be back again in a couple of days, another episode. This one, Darin, you've done the heavy lifting, and I'm just commenting. You've done great, and bring it home with the final edits.